Communist regimes are something of a world record holder when it comes to killing people. In fact, they've killed more than 100 million people in under a century, most of them within their own borders. And we're not even including the millions of lives that were essentially lost, toiling away in societies that banned freedom of religion, expression, property rights, and a number of other important things that most of us in the West consider essential to a thriving and free society. And considering all that, it shouldn't come as a surprise why many of us don't have a great deal of affection for Karl Marx, the popularizer of communism and the inspiration behind many of these said communist regimes. So why would anybody make the claim that another Marxist, a different Marxist, is actually more dangerous than Marx himself? And I'm not talking about the usual suspects like Lenin, Stalin, Mao, or Pol Pot, who were largely responsible for the aforementioned body counts. No, the person I'm talking about never ruled a country, never led an army, never engaged in mass extinction of entire populations or starved people to death. In fact, he himself died sickly and alone in a prison cell in fascist Italy. And that man was Antonio Gramsci. But despite never leading a revolution, his works, which would later become known as the Prison Papers, would answer a question that Marx had failed to, or at least failed to get right. And his answer would eventually lay the groundwork for much of the resurgence of communist thought right here in the United States, along with many other countries in the West. Because Marx had not just given a scathing critique of capitalism in his writings, he had offered a new vision of society, a communist one, where private property would be abolished, the dictatorship of the proletariat would first seize and then run the means of production, the traditional family would essentially be abolished, women would be liberated, and children would be raised collectively, and everyone would live happily ever after in abundance, taking joy in their work and having ample of time for leisure. Now, if you do a quick perusal of communist-led countries of the last 100 years, a rational person might come to the conclusion that, none of that happened. So clearly, Marx got a couple things wrong. But in the 1920s, before tens of millions of people had been killed, imprisoned, or starved to death, dedicated Marxists like Gramsci were pondering a different question that Marx got wrong, namely, about where these communist revolutions were likely to take place. See, according to Marx, the countries most susceptible to the communist message were supposed to be the capitalist ones, namely those countries which had fully implemented capitalism and were in what Marx had described as its later stages. This was supposed to be a point where, according to Marx, the inherent contradictions of capitalism would cause the workers to rise up, rebel, and seize the means of production. There was just one problem. It didn't really happen that way. Workers were not rebelling in the UK, France, Germany, or the United States, or if they were, they weren't getting very far. Communism wasn't succeeding in the West, but rather in places like Russia, which didn't really fit the model Marx predicted. And Gramsci understood this all too well as he watched fellow socialists turn from the Communist Party to the fascist one, eventually leading him to be imprisoned. So he set out to understand why and to explain how this might be corrected. He concluded that the problem with Marx's analysis was that he put too much emphasis on people identifying with their economic class and not enough attention to the surrounding culture and cultural institutions, which play an important role in providing meaning, purpose, and a sense of community. Essentially, Marx got it wrong, at least in part, when he tried to make the slogan, "Workers of the world unite." Because, as according to author Jonah Goldberg, Marx assumed that a factory worker in Rome would have more in common with a laborer of similar economic status in a country on the other side of the world than he would with the factory manager in the factory he worked at. Armed with this understanding, Gramsci said that if Marxism was to be successful, it had to hold off on the war of maneuver, i.e. violently seizing the means of production, and first focus on a war of position. Or put more simply, first seize the culture, then seize the other stuff. Gramsci went on to lay out a strategy for doing this that included infiltrating and taking over culturally shaping institutions and then using them to simultaneously demoralize the existing culture while creating an alternative one people could run to. Instead of Marx's approach of shoot first and hope people follow, Gramsci laid out the strategy for what later became known as the Long March through the institutions. Now you may be saying, cool, Nick, that's really interesting. A guy 100 years ago identified some problems with Marx's strategy and laid out a plan on how to set the necessary conditions to shape culture and usher in Marxist ideology. What exactly does that mean for me right here, right now, in the good old United States of America? Well, let's go down the list and ask some important questions about the institutions which shape life in America. I'll say the name of an institution, and you think about How favorable have they gotten towards socialism in the last 70 years? Hollywood. You can't even watch a cartoon anymore without there being a reference to some sort of leftist and ultimately socialist ideology. How about the federal bureaucracy? A massive government workforce which constantly works to advance its own power, authority, and budgets at the expense of the private sector. I mean, do I need to say more on that one? How about journalism? Sure, there are alternatives to what we might call legacy or the mainstream media. But the fact that we call news outlets conservative and liberal ones mainstream should tell us something about the ideological capture of journalism. How about academia? Look at any mainstream, there's that word again, state college in the United States, and you will find two things almost immediately: a liberal bias and billions of tax dollars used to support that bias. Not to mention that academia is where people go to get their teaching credentials in order to teach in the public schools. And if you think universities are left-wing in general, go check out the political donations from their education departments, not to mention the curriculum that they use. Even the church seems to have been partially captured, with pastors preaching more about social justice and abortion than they ever do the gospel. So considering all this, why is Gramsci ultimately a far more dangerous Marxist than Marx himself? Well, the West was able to stand up to and reject Marx's approach to implementing socialism. But thus far, we have proved far less able to resist Gramsci. But maybe that's starting to change.